Okay, I see that we are live on Facebook. Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to Freeform Friday, our show where you can learn about important legal issues and hear the latest news from Legal Aid of North Carolina. I'm Sean Driscoll. I'm the Director of Public Relations for Legal Aid. On today's episode, you are going to meet Tonia Trammell, our first ever Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Tanya is going to talk about her new role and how Legal Aid works to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, both internally and externally. During today's episode, if you have any questions for Tanya, please put them in the Facebook comments and we will answer them. All right, let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Tanya.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. As Sean stated, my name is Tonia Trammell, and I am the new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Legal Aid of North Carolina. I have been with the Legal Aid of North Carolina now for approximately 3 years. I actually started with Legal Aid when I was in law school. I started with a project called the Homeless Prevention Project. And essentially what that was is it was a volunteer program that we put together with the Crisis Assistance Ministries to provide free legal information concerning landlord-tenant rights to their clients. And the premise of that program was to provide this information to hopefully equip people who otherwise could not afford an attorney to be able to represent themselves in court. So that was my first exposure to legal aid back several years ago now. And I was brought in at the time under staff attorney Isaac Sergio, who is now one of our practice group managers for housing. I then had an externship with Legal Aid, and then I became employed with Legal Aid in 2018 as a housing paralegal. And my experience with working with Legal Aid as a housing paralegal is that, again, we're providing legal services to a population of people who otherwise could not afford the legal services, primarily low income individuals, and within that bracket, primarily marginalized groups of color and women. So in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion has always been something that has been, the mission of it has always been threaded through the Legal Aid of North Carolina's mission, even before they established an equity officer position. Back in 2015, our executive director, George Housen, did commission a diversity working group. And when I started with Legal Aid, that was one of the first committees that I became involved with. And I've actually been involved with that committee since my start with Legal Aid. And that committee has been primarily the group that has helped George and other directors to progress the mission of diversity, equity, inclusion at Lance. And then earlier this year, Lance had since recognized the need to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. But they did an internal search earlier this year, and I was hired as our first diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. So a lot of my role is helping staff with training and education and bringing some standardization of an equity process to Legal Aid. A lot of offices, as some of you may be aware, so Legal Aid is one organization, but we have many different offices throughout the states. And many of our local offices were doing their own DEI programming in their local areas. And so we kind of had this situation where there were a lot of different, and it's a good thing, but there are a lot of different types of diversity programs that were going on that were kind of disconnected. So part of this role is to create a more centralized, standardized experience for everyone in the organization, and to help promote equity throughout the organization, and then to help equip staff to go out and work with diverse clientele. Because I'm sure everyone knows, both clientele and staff is just going to continue to get more diverse as the years go on. So that's really the focus of this role. And I've only been in it a little over a month so far, and I've been really, really busy, but I have enjoyed the work that I've been doing, and I've enjoyed the people that I've been working with very much.
Great, thank you, Tanya. You and I were talking a little bit earlier, and we were talking about the concept of vicarious trauma. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Oh, sure. And thank you for reminding me, Sean. Yes, absolutely. So, um, vicarious trauma is the phenomenon that happens when a person is exposed on a regular basis and consistently to traumatic events that other people are experiencing. And what happens for the individual is they also experience a form of trauma, called vicarious trauma. I think with everything that's been going on in our society over the past year, with the onset of the pandemic, and then you have that compounded with all of these race-based killings and mass shootings and police killings that have been happening, the country as a whole, collectively, I think we're all experiencing a form of trauma. We're actually having a group discussion later on today internally for staff about trauma and just giving our staff a platform to kind of express and process and work through their thoughts. I think this week has been a really tough week for everybody with the Chauvin verdict. And then there are several other police killings between, this week and last week. It's just been a lot going on. And I think constant exposure to that is very traumatic. It actually makes me think about a quote in an interview by Will Smith back in 2016. He was interviewed and he made this quote that racism is not getting worse, it's just getting filmed. And I honestly don't know whether it's getting worse or not. I feel like there probably is a part of it that is, but I definitely agree with his point that we're seeing it more and we're experiencing the trauma associated with these events more because we're constantly being exposed to it. We're constantly being exposed to it in the news, it constantly being exposed to it on social media and on our social media feeds, whether it be Instagram, Facebook, whatever. It's like you can't turn it off. And I think that creates a heightened level of trauma for people. And then especially when you're considering people of color, Black people and brown people's experience, when you add the layer of race onto it and constantly seeing people who look like you have this violence enacted towards them, it's very traumatizing. And it's traumatizing in a quite unique way, I think, being a Black woman. So, I just would encourage people, because I know a lot of people listening to this may be experiencing some sort of trauma. I constantly unplug from social media. I take frequent breaks from social media, and they can be for weeks, even months at a time. I just do encourage people to unplug. I think that could be of help. If you have access to a counselor or therapist through your works insurance, there's a lot of free information online, counselors online. I would just encourage people to just take care of themselves, practice good self-care, take care of your mental health, and check in with people if you need that.
I recognize the irony of telling people to unplug from social media on Facebook, but
right?
Yeah,
right.
but I agree with you, and I think it's an important and relatively easy step that people can take to take care of themselves. Mm-hmm. You may have touched on this when you were talking earlier, but one of your roles that you've had here at Legal Aid is you were a paralegal in the housing unit of our Charlotte office.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the intersection of what you saw in our housing work in Charlotte with racial justice or racial injustice.
Well, I mean, I think so. The intersection is kind of going back to, with Charlotte in particular, majority of the clients that we serve in the housing unit are women of color, primarily Black women. And these are low income individuals as well. So a lot of our clients are in situations where without legal aid, they would not have access to any type of justice concerning their situation. They would just be left to face it on their own. And that kind of goes back to the equity and the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece. So a lot of times people get equity and equality confused. They're similar, but they're not the same thing, even though a lot of times people use those two terms interchangeably. So in my opinion, equity is really what you use to true equality for people. But when you're looking at equity, what you're really doing is you're looking at those historic barriers for people and certain populations. You're looking at those historic barriers and how certain populations of people have been historically disenfranchised in our country. And what you're doing is you're giving them what they need to even be at a level playing field with everybody else. And then from there, once you get people who have had barriers to any type of success or advancement historically, once you help to eliminate those barriers, then you can seek to reach equality once there's a level playing field. So that's really what equity does. And that's kind of like that nuanced difference between equity and equality. And as far as the work in the housing unit, I think that's what we all do at Legal Aid in general, but speaking specifically about the work in the housing unit in Charlotte, that is really what we did all the time. Like the attorneys and legal advocates in that particular unit are very vested in the positive outcomes for their clients. They are hard workers. We do have a very diverse staff of attorneys in the Charlotte office in particular. So a lot of them can empathize very readily with the situations of their clients. So I think that it definitely intersects that diversity and equity piece as far as the housing work goes for the Charlotte unit, definitely.
And I think you just brought up an important point about how our internal diversity helps with our external client advocacy, which is if the majority of our clients coming to us, like for housing in Charlotte, are African-American women, then it's important that there are African-American women who are our attorneys, who can serve them, who can empathize. And empathy is different from sympathy. Empathy is, I've been there, I know it, and that's really important. And that helps our client advocacy. Trust between clients and attorneys is really important. And so if there's that additional foundation anything that can help build trust is good.
Yes.
So that's how, internal, our internal diversity can help with our external client advocacy. I was going to ask you another question. I'm not sure. I think I've forgotten it, and I'm looking at the Facebook comments and nothing has come in yet. Just another plug for that. If you're watching this and you have any questions for Tanya, please feel free to put them in the Facebook comments and we will get them answered. I really did have something else for you, but I can't think of it. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I think that is pretty much it. Again, I just want to, iterate the work that Legal Aid does. And in my time with Legal Aid, I've had the opportunity to work with some really great people, both staff and clients. And I really appreciate that Legal Aid does what it does, in the sense that, like I said before, it provides the opportunity for people who otherwise would not have the opportunity to have, and I don't even want to say adequate legal counsel, like superb legal counsel, because we have some of the best attorneys and legal advocates and paralegals out there working for Legal Aid, and some of the most experienced, and they provide excellent legal service, and they fight really, really hard for our clients. And so I just want to reiterate my appreciation of the type of work that Legal Aid does. I feel like it's very important holistically, in the holistic picture, is in regards to progressing social justice and equity. I think Legal Aid's role is integral in doing that, not just as an organization, but when you're looking at the larger picture of dismantling inequities and systemic racism, Legal Aid plays an integral part in that holistically for the state of North Carolina, and then overall as a country. So I really appreciate that position that Legal Aid has.
Absolutely. We at Legal Aid, I'm not a lawyer either, and I'm just in awe of our lawyers sometimes, what they do. We can handle a lot of our cases without ever having to go to court. But when we do go to court, we win 70% of the time. And we're up against big law firms, lawyers making a lot more money than our lawyers make, and we win because we are that good. And part of it is the dedication of our attorneys to fighting these systemic inequalities. It's passion, it's mission driven. And it's really, the work that legal aid does is really, really important, and there's really no one else doing it. And I remember what I was going to say to you earlier. You mentioned something about like historic inequities. And I think the situation in our Charlotte housing unit is so perfectly exemplifies that. I've heard Isaac Sturgill, who is our head housing attorney at Legal Aid, who used to be a housing attorney in Charlotte before he became our head statewide housing attorney. I've heard him say that the housing clients in Charlotte are like 90% African-American women. 90%. So you have to think, why is that? Is the rental market in Charlotte consists of 90% African-American women? No. I don't know what the numbers are, but I can guarantee you it's not 90% African-American women. So why is the eviction burden falling so heavily on African-American women? And I'm not enough of a historian to say why, but Matthew Desmond, who wrote a great book called Evicted that everyone who's listening to this should read, shows that nationwide, this is the case. The burden of eviction falls overwhelmingly, disproportionately on African-American women. He has a great quote that Isaac is fond of saying that Black men are locked up, Black women are locked out. And so that is a result of historic inequities. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And just to piggyback a little bit off of what you're saying, Sean, there is a lot that goes into that. That book that you referenced, I've read that book too, Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And then another good book to read, because there's a lot into it. And this live would probably go several hours long if we were to get into all of the historical issues that contribute to what you're talking about. But that book by Matthew Desmond, and then there's another book that is a favorite of Legal Aid's, is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And that book very succinctly talks about the history of housing discrimination and how it started and how it basically has created this continuum of racial segregation in housing up until this day. And it does, and there are several things when you talk about redlining, the Public Works Administration, when you talk about race-based covenants and deeds, which kept African-American people out of certain neighborhoods and from being able to acquire mortgages. And then, you move into the 60s and 70s with the onset of welfare. And now we're moving more towards mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex that is locking up Black men at alarming rates. And you kind of see the Black family during that time begin to separate. Now in, 2021, you see this phenomenon of exactly what Isaac was talking about, where you're seeing a lot of Black men being locked up and a lot of Black women being locked out of advancement, but also kind of locked into this perpetual cycle of poverty and being being customers of subsidized services, which is fine. If you need that, absolutely take advantage of what you need, but it does create a disparity and a wealth gap, a large wealth gap between African-American people and white people. There's actually a lot of studies where it shows actually what the trajectory is when you see like the actual gap in wealth between African-American people in the United States and the white Americans, and then Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. Like there's a whole breakdown of it. And there's a lot of studies done around that type of work. But when we look at historical barriers, that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about that creates that inequity. So when we're talking about equity, we're talking about these practices, and a lot of them have been legal at some point. So that's where you get the concept of systemic racism, because that's racism that has been legalized through policies, state laws, and statutes. So you have legalized racism that has created barriers for particular groups of color, and not just Black people, but pretty much any person of color in America can at some point in their history can pinpoint having experienced some sort of systemic racism in America. So, you have these barriers that were systemically put in place that have created a reality of disenfranchisement and marginalization that still exists. I mean, that stuff takes a while to go away. There's a quote that says, it takes longer to heal a wound than it does to inflict it. So it's like, you put these policies in place in the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, when you're talking about redlining, we're talking specifically about some of the things that have contributed to housing discrimination. But those policies that were put in place in the early 1930s that may have only been in place for probably about 3 decades, the effects of that can last generations. And so when people are talking about equity versus equality, it is important that you keep those things in mind as you have the discussion about real equity and moving that forward, and really helping people who historically have been in positions where they've been locked out, not been able to achieve advancement. They've been systemically locked out of being able to achieve an advancement, and they've been locked out during a time in our country where it was really rapidly expanding. During the time where you had like redlining and you had colonialism, that was like a pioneering time in our country, the likes that we will never see again. So the opportunities to accumulate wealth like it was back in that part of our history, we're not going to see that again. So, during that time in our history, you had a group of people who were able to achieve that wealth, and everybody else was locked out of it, and slowly over time, more groups got more exposure to opportunities for advancement, but still you can never go back to 1815, you see what I'm saying, or 1619, and sort of develop from there the vast opportunities that were available for colonizers at that time.
Right. I feel like you and I could keep talking about this stuff
Yes,
long after anyone else was paying attention. We have one question on Facebook. Let's see. The question is it true that many of the programs or subsidies were started for the benefit of white populations rather than non-white?
So this is true. So back in, I think, 1933, 1934, you had the Public Works Administration, right, that started develop subsidized housing for white Americans at the time who could not afford housing. So that is a misconception when people think about subsidized housing. They think that it started with, giving housing to Black women, and that's not the case. If you go back to the beginning of subsidized housing history, it started around about, I think it was 1933, 1934, somewhere around that time in the mid 1930s. The Public Works Administration started America's first, subsidized housing programs for white Americans. And then as that grew, the government started creating opportunities for white Americans to own homes. And so what was happening is that a lot of these white Americans were being moved out of these subsidized projects that were created and moved into homes. And then African American people were able to move into these projects subsequently afterwards. Now, a lot of these projects were set up, and subsidies were set up in areas that were industrial areas that were close to factories and jobs. So that was another big piece of that too, which is why you have a lot of these now in inner cities and in urban neighborhoods, because that's where the jobs were historically. And then, you know, from there, what you had happening is white Americans, so the government was making it very easy for white Americans to attain mortgages through the onset of the FHA. But what was happening is now you have the onset of redlining, right? So you have these security maps that were drawn around neighborhoods, like they were actually, you know, drawn color coded around neighborhoods. And they all the colors were for different grades of neighborhood. You started with, I think it's blue, either blue or green was the most preferred neighborhood. Well, they were the most preferred too. So you had like green being the most preferred, where white Americans were living and able to be insured for mortgages. Then you had blue, where middle-class white American families were being approved for mortgages. Then your yellow color-coded neighborhoods that were for lower class white Americans and maybe some foreign-born individuals. And then you had your red line areas that were for lower class foreign-born and Black American citizens. And those are the areas that we see now, in addition to areas that have these subsidies and projects that are really impoverished and dilapidated. And what has happened is that kind of racial segregation, we haven't really dismantled that completely. So when you have these sections in the United States that are primarily people of color, but are extremely impoverished, you know, that comes from the legacy of redlining. And the implications of that are, so now, so everyone knows that, you know, property ownership and the value of property drives things like schools, like public school systems, and how effective those public school systems are, because your taxes from property taxes are going towards your public schools in that area. So if you have an area where either there's low home ownership or the homes in that area are less valued because of the area that they're in, you don't have a lot of tax dollars going to support quality schools. Another consequence is that you have, you know, food deserts in these areas. You have higher crime rate in these areas. You have disparities with quality healthcare in these areas. So there are a lot. And like you just said, Sean, we could talk about them forever, but to answer that person's question, the answer is yes. And there has been a history with a lot of different factors that can be linked right up to many people's circumstances today.
Yes. And to answer that person's question, anyone should double check me on this before taking my word for it, but I'm pretty sure that one of the very first housing projects in the US was built in South Boston for Irish immigrants, white people. I have my family relatives in Massachusetts, so I've heard that all my life. It might not be true, but I think I've heard it enough. All right, well, that is it for the Facebook questions, and we've gone about 30 minutes. So I think, Tanya, unless you have anything else to add, I think we can wrap up.
No, that was it. And thank you so much for having me today. I was nervous, but this was fun.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone else who watched this for joining us, and everyone who watches this recording. We hope you enjoyed it. If you are watching this as a recording and you have any questions for Tanya, please feel free to put them in the comments and we'll still try to get them answered. And as always, if you need legal help with any civil legal issue, housing, public benefits, domestic violence, consumer rights, credit, foreclosure, please call our toll-free helpline at 1-866-219-5262 and visit our website at legalaidnc.org. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll see you next Friday.